So what I intend to do is to basically walk you through what are the achievements and challenges encountered in implementing the previous master plan on ASEAN connectivity, the 2010 version, and what leads us into developing the new master plan of ASEAN Connectivity 2025. What has changed, what we have learned from those implementation issues, and what are the new strategic areas, and how we intend to carry forward this new master plan. So let me basically start by saying that back in 2009, ASEAN leaders issued a statement on connectivity, highlighting the importance of ASEAN connectivity after ASEAN has basically ratified the ASEAN Charter in 2008. ASEAN has adopted the roadmap for ASEAN Community, which is the ASEAN Economic Community, Political Security Community, Social Cultural Community, as well as the Initiative for ASEAN Integration Work Plan 2. What is important at that particular juncture was ASEAN needs to be more integrated. We need a mechanism to deal with cross-sectoral issues. We need to look at how we can make the region more cohesive, how we can make the region more integrated with the global economy. So the starting point was that there was recognition that we need to strengthen institutional building within the organization and also with our various partners. On top of that, there's also recognition that ASEAN needs to put on more efforts in terms of infrastructure development. However, when we go into the discussions, then there were thoughts about the most important aspects, which is the people-to-people connectivity needs to also be included. So hence you have connectivity having three different dimensions: physical, institutional, and people-to-people connectivity. So each one of them look at different aspects. One looks at infrastructure, one looks at institutions, and the other one looks at people-to-people linkages. During the last 5 years, the master plan has made some significant progress, but there remains to be things that we need to do. In terms of physical connectivity, there are no more ASEAN Highway Network missing links. Basically below class 3 routes have been reduced by 46% since 2010. 9 power interconnection projects have been completed. Most notably, I think it would be the West Kalimantan Sarawak project, which has been now in operation since last year. So what else needs to be done? Of course, there's the issue of the Singapore-Kunming rail link. From Singapore to Phnom Penh, the link has been established. The section between Aranya Pratet to Klong Lok, the 6 kilometer, has been completed since August last year. So the missing link now is between the section within border of Cambodia to Phnom Penh and the border of Cambodia, Vietnam to Ho Chi Minh City. So those two sections are quite a lengthy section. The Cambodia section is about 256 kilometers, and the Vietnam section is 129 kilometers. The other aspects will be the ASEAN Highway Network. There are 4 sections which are still below class 3, so there's a need to improve those roads to at least class 3 roads, and they are predominantly in Laos as well as in Myanmar. We have also undertaken work on the roll-on, roll-off network. I think with the assistance of JICA, 3 priority routes have been agreed upon. Now the effort is to operationalize these 3 priority routes. I think the countries themselves are currently discussing this. In terms of institutional connectivity, the ASSIST, which is the ASEAN Solution for Investment, Services and Trade, as well as ASEAN Trade Repository has been launched. The services related to ASEAN Single Aviation Market, the various technical work plans has also been adopted. Ratification of the various air services agreements are currently ongoing. It's almost done, except 1 or 2 countries. In terms of standards, a policy guideline has been adopted. Challenges remains in operationalizing the transport facilitation agreements that we have, and also to tackle non-tariff barriers. We all know that tariff elimination is largely completed. The main issue is related to trade facilitation matters. In this context, it is also important to expedite the completion of the national single windows towards the operationalization of the ASEAN single window. I think live data exchange has been done between a couple of countries, but I think effort will need to be intensified to move this to other countries as well. In terms of people-to-people connectivity, the ASEAN Virtual Learning Center has been launched. I think there's a soft launch. Full details are still being developed. A number of initiatives related to education has currently being undertaken. Mutual recognition arrangements have been completed, but effort needs to be undertaken to operationalize these mutual recognition arrangements. In terms of visa requirements for ASEAN nationals, there will be no requirement for ASEAN nationals to travel to any countries, I think with the exception of Malaysia and Myanmar, which we hope will be resolved very, very soon. So in a nutshell, what are those challenges that we faced in terms of implementing the master plan on ASEAN Connectivity 2010? So we can basically categorize them into 3 different issues. First relates to financing issues. So when we talk about financing, the first part relates to fiscal capacity. There's always finite resources in terms of government budget. So what are the things that we need to look at? What are the priorities that we need to accord? We all know that infrastructure investment, for example, are large. The requirements are more than 110 billion per annum. Of course, that's requirements. Actual investment is far, far much lower than that. So how do you address these issues? So with limited budget, you will need to look at whether the budget is for infrastructure or for other more urgent needs, such as healthcare and so on and so forth, education and so on. The second issue relates to return on investment. You may allocate budget for some projects, but the project needs to be attractive to attract private sector investment or basically attract our partners to fund some of the initial feasibility studies or pre-feasibility studies and so on. So often this is an issue. I guess an assessment needs to be done, and I'll elaborate more on how we intend to address this at the regional level. Capital availability is also linked to whether there's sufficient capital and whether the country's capital market is well developed enough to enable funds to be tapped. And we can actually obtain the capital at a lower cost. The second issue links to decision making. We have first, how do we prioritize different areas that we have? In the former master plan, we have a number of issues. How do we ensure that this takes priority over others? And also, each country will have their own national priorities, and national priorities basically stay. We also have priorities sometimes in some countries, provincial level and so on. So how do we basically manage the process to ensure that there is certain bottoms-up approach where this will become a regional priority consistent with national priorities? Often than not, the issue of costs and benefits also needs to be taken into account, because if the stakeholders are unable to see the benefits in participating in such projects, then there will be resistance to undertaking this initiative. I guess sometimes it's also very difficult for us to come up with concrete cost and benefit analysis, given that there are various assumptions. Then the other aspects is linked to misalignment of incentives. different agencies or different stakeholders have various different incentives. How do you bring different stakeholders with different interests to the same table and agree on the same goals? I think that will continue to be a challenge. For example, within the master plan itself for the 2010 version, there are 28 sectors involved. So if you bring certain initiative, let's say if you take physical connectivity aspects, to get an infrastructure project up, you will need multiple number of agencies involved. You cannot have one agency discuss one issue somewhere, another agency discuss this issue elsewhere. So you can discuss them, but you need a forum where different agencies come together and discuss them, and then you can discuss at your own respective forum subsequently. But then it has to have interaction between different agencies. And that is only at the regional level. How about at the national level? How about at the provincial level, and so on? So, so as long as these incentives are not being clearly identified and outlined, and responsibilities are also, and roles and responsibilities are not clearly identified, then it will be very difficult to undertake these projects. So if you imagine that you have 28 sectors, one initiative, you have 5, 6 sectors, you multiply by 10 countries. If you multiply further by provincial areas, it's going to be massive. So I think that's something that we need to address. The third issue relates to implementation. Even if there is an agreement to undertake a certain policies or projects or undertaking, there's often the issue of capacity. Whether either the officials have the capacity to undertake them, or either in some cases whether the stakeholders or the sectors themselves have the capacity to undertake them. So I guess a lot of effort will need to be put into capacity building to ensure that there's follow-through actions. Second issue is coordination, which is linked to incentive. Usually in ASEAN, a lot of policies are done in a top-down approach. It is not usually done bottoms-up. In some cases, we do have processes that deals with that, but often it is done top-down. There are reasons for that, but in certain aspects, I think we would, in the new plan, we try to have much more of a bottoms-up approach, as well as some of the top-down approach. And coordination, again, stretches across multiple agencies, and these are just internal to ASEAN. Then you will have to look at coordination with our dialogue partners, countries outside of ASEAN, international organizations. Each has their own goals and agenda, right? So you will have international organization coming to you to say that, well, we'll be able to do this for you, but we need to have a formal tie-up so that we can secure funding from someone. So basically, there are all these issues that you will need to deal with when it comes to coordination. So it's not just coordination within, but also coordination beyond the region. Then the third issue relates to regulatory structures. We can agree on one policy at the regional level, but how do you translate that agreement at the regional level into implementation at the national level, let alone at the provincial level and others? So, so laws may need to be changed, regulations may need to be changed, rules may need to be changed, but some of those are not easy to change, especially if they are constitution, right? So our approach is a bit different than if you talk about the EU, where the EU has a green paper process. The EU looks at it from where you will have to, each country will have to go through the consultation process. So once you have you reach the date where you're supposed to transpose the agreement, then the rules and laws are changed. But in ASEAN, we do it a different way. Because if we were to do that, then it will take a much longer time sometimes. Sometimes the EU sees benefits in that. Of course, unofficially, they'll tell us that. Officially, it's a different story. So basically, national translation of regional agreements into national implementation has continued to be an issue. It's not just an issue with the master plan, but it's an issue in all other plans within ASEAN. I think that's something that often is one agenda in most ministerial meetings as well as in the ASEAN summit. The issue is how do we deal with it, right? So the stakeholders are broad, and I guess a lot of this requires us to continue to build this consensus, continue to build confidence, continue to build capacity, and then in that context, we can put these three: consensus, confidence, and capacity to build our community. So that's something that I think we need to basically continue to work on if we want to implement many of these initiatives that we have. So taking into account of the challenges that we made in terms of the master plan ASEAN connectivity, we have also undertaken an assessment of what are the trends critical to ASEAN connectivity. So we have surveyed 10 trends that will have some impact on connectivity, so that we want to make sure that whatever we put in place in the new master plan, it has some relevance to what is happening in the current global landscape as well as the regional landscape. So in this context, I think the 10 trends that we have come up with is, first, there's a rise in ASEAN consuming class. ASEAN consuming class is expected to grow to about 163 million. And the bulk of it is actually in Indonesia, right? More than half of them are actually in Indonesia. And the second element is there'll be a productivity and competitiveness challenge. ASEAN would need to also more than double the historical rates of productivity gains. That is an issue because education level attainment is still an issue in this region. More than, what, 60%? About 60% has only primary education and below, ASEAN-wide. Of course, some countries will have more, some countries will have much less. So as country grows, we need the skilled labor force to actually meet the requirements. Otherwise, investment will not come in without the manpower. The other issue is, the third trend is the rise of the middleweights. We expect that about additional 90 million people are forecast to move to cities in ASEAN. And the focus here is not necessarily the capital cities, but is more on the middleweight cities where population is about 200,000 to 2 million. I guess these are cities where they could learn from some of the capital cities, and that could actually help to narrow the gap between the urban area and the rural area in particular countries. So how do we take opportunity of the rise of these middleweight cities? The third aspect, the fourth aspect is infrastructure opportunity. There are various estimates out there, from 60 billion to 200 billion per year. They come from different institutions, but the message is the same. Infrastructure requirements are large, right? So how do we deal with infrastructure requirements that are so large? Well, actual investment in infrastructure based on some estimates, in about 10 to 15 billion, while our requirements are more than 100 billion. So there is a gap in that context. So how do we narrow that particular gap? Of course, there are new funding mechanisms coming on board, but how do we ensure that this new funding mechanism will be able to finance some of these projects or some of these financing gaps that we are facing? Transformation of global flows, I'm sure you heard about. There is, first, there's Trans-Pacific Partnership. Second, there's Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And there are various other agreements. Of course, in recent times, they do face some issues in terms of ratification and so on. But these are trends that are growing, and we will need to take into account how these will impact, because some ASEAN member states are part of these agreements as well. The sixth aspect, the skills challenge. This is linked to the earlier part. ASEAN has the third largest labor force, But unfortunately, there is a massive gap in human capital. So we need to increase the skill of the labor force that we have, and address the 60% that have primary education or lower. So if you look at secondary education, it's about 80% and lower. So tertiary education is only about 10 to 15%, depends on the estimates. I think we need to increase that, and also we need to look at which area these support should be in. 7 area links to disruptive technologies. Of course, McKinsey Global Institute estimates that disruptive technologies could unleash about 220 billion to 625 billion impact in ASEAN. But of course, there are a lot of assumptions being made to arrive at these figures. So this is something that impacts all of us. Every one of us have a smartphone, use some apps and so on. So how can ASEAN benefit from this? How can ASEAN also be part of this? Rather than being a user, can we be also an innovator in this context? The 8th trends relates to the resource revolution. It was forecasted that demand for energy in ASEAN is going to increase through 2035 by about 80%. But I think IEA says about 70%, so it depends which institute they're looking at. But certainly demand is going up. Of course, that is not the picture today, where we have an oversupply in the oil market. But we look through to 2035, that particular picture can actually change if there's a rebalancing. Then the 9th trends relates to global debt has increased. So there are issues related to this. If you look at the markets for the past few days, any hint of a Fed rate hike, there's some concern in the markets. And all this has been going on for a number of years, and how would this actually put a challenge to the global economic situation or growth in the next few years? Then, of course, there's geopolitical trends that's happening. And we cannot detach what is happening in economic development, socio-cultural development with political developments. They are all interrelated in one way. So taking into account these 10 different trends, taking into account of the challenges that we faced in implementing the Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity 2010, then the member states has gone through a number of what are the areas that could actually drive connectivity moving forward. And what we have done is we basically feels that we will maintain the importance of the 3 dimensions of connectivity: physical, institutional, and people-to-people connectivity. Well, this is one of the idea that, well, some would say we managed to export to APEC or to ASEAN, because APEC use the same 3 dimension and ASEAN use the same 3 dimension as well. Well, I think it reflects the collaborative effort of different forums, rather than we export one idea to another. But basically, we share best practices and we try to collaborate on these key different areas. Then, while maintaining these 3 different dimensions, there's an importance to maintain certain focus in our approach. Basically, we had a few areas that we have put forward. Eventually, after some deliberations, we have narrowed down to 5 strategic areas, which is sustainable infrastructure, digital innovation, seamless logistics, regulatory excellence, and people mobility. So these are broad strategic areas, but we need more specific initiative to deliver these strategic areas. So the work is not expected to be done also by 2025, but it gives an idea what are these areas and what are the things that we need to do over the next 9 years plus. So in coming up with these different strategic areas, there was a process put in place to consult different stakeholders. So once we have come out with the 5 strategic areas, we need to think of what are those initiatives that can contribute towards these strategic areas. So what we do is we had something called policy laboratories. So policy laboratories were actually conducted for each of the 5 strategic areas. So this is where we invite a group of people who are supposed to be experts in those areas. So they come from different backgrounds, from government officials, academia, from the industry, so that we are able to sort of like think through what are those initiatives that can come out. So there were a long list of initiatives at the very beginning. Then we narrow down to a few that we think can be implemented over the next 9 to 10 years. And after that particular process of having a policy laboratories, we generate these ideas and initiatives, then we put through a stakeholder forum. So stakeholder forum where we invited the private sectors, the government officials, as well as some of our partners and international organizations. So to sort of like not stress test, but to basically test whether this initiative can go through, can actually be implemented. Then we have an internal round of discussions, and then the drafting process starts. So in a way, this is a little bit like what we call a bottoms-up approach to some extent, but yeah, to basically get feedback from stakeholders and inputs from different stakeholders as well. So in terms of the master plan, what is important is it cuts across different sectors. It is perceived as a cross-sectoral mechanism, a cross-sectoral, a cross-pillar mechanism to actually coordinate or to facilitate implementation in the different aspects of connectivity dimensions as well as community pillars. So, for example, if we talk about sustainable infrastructure, it is heavily focused on physical connectivity because it's infrastructure per se, but there are also elements of institutional aspects, the soft aspects, in aspects linked to people, where people can use the infrastructure built. Whereas when we talk about the community dimension, it is heavy on the ASEAN Economic Community, partly because transportation, finance, all under that. But it has some aspects on social-cultural as well, because we also need to look into issues of environment, issues of labor, or displacements of people and so on. So those are actually issues tackled under ASEAN Social-Cultural Community. So it is not an undertaking that is confined to one particular area, but it touches upon a number of different stakeholders in terms of different community pillars and different dimensions for connectivity. So the same goes with the other areas. Maybe I'll take another example on digital innovation. So digital innovation will be very much in terms of policy linked to trying to encourage more digital innovation. It's also linked to development of internet backbone and stuff like that. In terms of the community aspects, it touches on primarily AEC because the telecommunication corporation is under AEC. But it also has a strong focus on the social-cultural aspect because of the application of this digital technology to, let's say, health, to education, and so on. So it's not often perceived as just an AEC. Digital innovation is not just about AEC, but it's also about the ASEAN Social-Cultural Community from the application perspective. And even in the APSC context, when we talk about cybersecurity, because cybersecurity cooperation is under political security in ASEAN. So there will be also some limited focus there. So in that context, it's not an undertaking that just within a particular pillar of the community building process. So I think this basically tries to capture that the connectivity agenda cuts across this. Then we also went through with the sectors, how can the master plan add value to ASEAN sectoral work plans. In the ASEAN scheme of things, you would have first a community blueprints. You have different community blueprints, the AEC, the APSC, the ASCC. You also have the sectoral work plans. ASEAN has about 31 sectoral ministerial body. So every ministerial body has their own work plan. Then you have your sub-regional arrangement work plan. Then you have your, each partner, the IOs have their own work plan, right? So how do you add value and how do you find ways to have a significant impact on others? So we think through this and got this A, B, C, D, E area of value. Of course, the issue is not simple as A, B, C, D, E, but it certainly helped us to think about how we can add value to what is already on the plate. What are the additional elements which are not tackled in any of these plans that we can include? So for example, if we talk about sustainable infrastructure, in ASEAN we have transport plan, we have energy plan, we have different plans. But the plans looks at specific projects within each of the sectoral plans. But it doesn't look at it on, okay, if this is a transport plan, this is a transport project, how do I develop this transport project from where they are now towards financial close or towards eventual operation and maintenance? So that is not something that is tackled, because a lot of these projects are done by the country themselves, right? Sourcing is done by the country itself, but the discussion is not necessarily done at the regional level. So we think that by having an infrastructure strategy, then we can think through the entire life cycle of an infrastructure project. But we need to be cognizant of the challenges, so we are not going to look at it beyond financial close or even close to financial close. I guess a lot of work can be done at the early stages rather than at the later stages. Of course, the private sector are more interested in nearing the financial close and after the financial close. The second aspect is breadth, how we can expand the various initiative, how if there's a certain initiative on the table, how do we add on more breadth to that initiative? We can add on other aspects. Or sometimes when we have an ICT plan, we look at certain development of ICT plan, but we didn't think about application to certain other sectors. So how do we add breadth to that particular initiative? Third aspect is coordination. I think this is everywhere. This is something that everyone recognizes, but difficult to actually implement. We have various mechanisms in place, but sometimes these mechanisms are there, but actual coordination is still a challenge. But I think we have made a lot of progress in these areas, but I guess more can be done. The fourth aspect is depth. You may have an initiative, but the details are not being thought through. So we need to include more details into that particular initiative. And the last one is just to provide greater emphasis if it's important. So there will be very little on the E part, more on the A, B, C, D, E. So given all this consideration, we have developed 15 initiatives under 5 strategic areas. So under sustainable infrastructure, there are 3 initiatives. So in terms of sustainable infrastructure, basically, we know that infrastructure requirements are large. We know that there will be about 110 billion required annually. Of course, that's an estimate. We know that there is an issue related to project preparation. And often we get visits from some multinational companies who basically says that there are just not enough projects in the market. So there's need to be work done to bring more projects into the market. There are a lot of financial institutions, but the size of the number of projects in the market are very limited. So there are a lot of demand for more upstream work to prepare projects. And often they will tell us, okay, we know that there's these projects, but there's no way we can come in. There's no way we can participate. And we have all these ideas, but we're not sure what are the details of these projects. So a lot of work needs to be done in order to bring those projects from an idea or from a concept to something that is a project that can be presented to stakeholders. So the idea is to basically come out with first project briefs, project details. Second is to come out with a roadmap on how we can bring that project from where they are now to, let's say, financial close, or close to financial close, or prepare a business case. And these all require resources. These all require capacity. Capacity not just from the member states' perspective, but capacity also from even the private sector as well. Often we always think about capacity required for government officials, but sometimes even the private sector in certain contexts need to have some capacity invested in this. So then present a business case. I guess ultimately once you have reached a certain stage where an interested partner is willing to take on, then it can be presented further towards financial close and so on. The role for ASEAN beyond that will be very difficult because many of these are done between the countries and the funding agencies, because you will have to establish SPV and so on, so those are done within the country mechanism. The other initiative is there's also an importance of having the need to increase or improve infrastructure productivity, right? So we make full use of existing infrastructure, or we basically look at quality infrastructure in such a way that we do not need to spend a lot of money in terms of operational and maintenance. And this is also linked to project selection. So careful project selection will actually help to also increase the productivity and the life cycle of that particular infrastructure project. So in this context, we are looking at how we can come up with indices to track this progress, and also what are the best practices that is being done in other areas, in other regions. The third aspect is something that you don't necessarily find in ASEAN, because ASEAN is often we look at national, we look at capital countries and so on, not necessarily about urbanization issues. Because many will view urbanization as within a country, right? So, but in this context, we are trying to look at, we're going to start the process to think about sharing of best practices on urbanization. Some countries can do urbanization better than others, and there are potential in terms of the middleweight cities. So how, if you can develop a city very well, you can basically share the idea with middleweight cities in other countries. So I think there is a possibility for that sharing of best practices to take place in the region. So this is no doubt a challenge, going to be a challenge for us, because urbanization is not something that we normally think about when we are in the ASEAN context. But there's something we need to really look into, because infrastructure requirements, the large number that we have, 80% is in the urban area. So technically, we still have to address that, but of course we have to address the urban-rural issue as well, right? Because the rural folks will always say, all the money will go to the urban area, and you forget about the rural folks. So there need to be some discussion there as well. Okay, the second strategic area is related to digital innovation. As mentioned earlier, we are talking about, well, 220 billion to 625 billion. Well, I mean, that is McKinsey Global Institute's figure. But the challenge for us is there are opportunities in this area, and given that the vision of the Master Plan of ASEAN Connectivity 2025 is basically linked to having an inclusive ASEAN, And these particular aspects can actually help us to narrow the gap and bring about an inclusive ASEAN. So we thought through 4 initiatives. In fact, there were other initiatives that was being put forward during the drafting session. One of them is to have universal access. Another one is to have broadband development and so on. But some of those are already captured in the ICT master plan. So we said there's no much value add to actually do those things. And broadband, the view is some country broadband is left to individual country to build them. So if it's important, it can be actually parked under sustainable infrastructure subsequently. So we have not actually have that as an initiative under digital innovation. So the first aspect is micro, small, and medium enterprises. You have heard a lot about the importance of these micro, small, medium enterprises, given that they constitute a large number of part of the economy. Almost 90% of enterprises are MSMEs. So the idea here is to how we can enhance the MSME participation in the entire community building efforts. No doubt it's difficult because they are often talks about they lack financial access, technological access, capacity, and so on. So how do we bring them on board? So one way is to look at something that other regions have done, maybe something like Connect Americas or something like something that we can create a platform for MSME to obtain such information easier. So, so this particular initiative is linked to looking into that. And the second initiative is ASEAN Digital Financial Inclusion. We know that in ASEAN, bank account ownership has increased quite a bit in recent years. I think from 2011 to 2014, there's an increase from about 42% to about 50% of the population. But that's still low relative to OECD countries. And then account access is one thing, account usage is the other thing. Because account usage is still far lower than OECD. For those people who has an account usage is about 56% in ASEAN compared to 75% in OECD. Means that you actually use your account once a month. You put money in or you withdraw money. So basically, account usage is still relatively low. Probably not in Singapore, but in some other ASEAN member states, where you even have account holdership is actually less than 20%. So many of them go through all those informal channels, and that can be costly and that can be risky. So I guess there is an effort to do that. In fact, the World Bank and the finance track is holding a financial inclusion symposium next week in Malaysia. So the third aspect is on open data. I guess there have been a lot of talk about open data having impact on government delivery and so on. It could unleash a lot of potential for people to actually use those information and develop services that can contribute to the community. So in this context, I think what we are trying to look at is to come up with an open data dictionary. What are those data available that can be made access to the public? So we have to work very closely with the statistical people as well as also with the producer of those data. And the fourth aspect is digital data governance. A lot of data flows. We all know that is taking place. Data flows globally has increased 45 times since 2005, the bandwidth. So that's massive and it's going to continue to increase. So how do we basically deal with this increasing cross-border data issues? So, so the plan is to look at the various regulations in place and how we can come out with a framework to basically encourage such flows. The third strategic area, do I still have, I have plenty of time, okay. So the third strategic areas is seamless logistics. You can't be really connected if you don't have good logistical system, right? So in this particular initiative, we are looking at two particular initiatives, these strategic areas. One is to strengthen the competitiveness through enhanced trade routes and logistics. In this context, we are looking at identifying several trade routes or trade corridor or economic corridors, and then collect information, database on these different corridors. And then we move on to the second initiative, is to identify, choke point is a word that we use, we actually borrow from APEC. They have 8 choke points in the APEC connectivity blueprint, but some will use barriers and so on. So what are the challenges we encounter in those different trade routes and economic corridor? So these are not just land, this can be actually maritime. So there will be, because maritime issues will be rather similar, but I think the complexity and the dimension will be a little bit different. So there will also be a maritime dimension to that, how we can ensure that there is a seamless logistics, because in ASEAN, some ASEAN member states are archipelagic in nature, right? So this particular aspect is important to us. So these will be two different initiatives to deal with logistics. We are looking at it from a very supply chain aspects, rather than we will fit into a global value chain, which is being tackled under the AEC Blueprint 2025. The fourth strategic area is regulatory excellence. The focus here is on two aspects. One is on standards and technical regulations, and the second one is linked to addressing non-tariff measures that are trade distorting. So we are not going to do everything, but we are just going to look at 3 prioritized product groups and then try to go through a good regulatory practice and tackle the standards aspects, from standards to mutual recognition to technical regulations. Same with non-tariff measures, trade distorting, we are looking at also several prioritized product groupings. This will actually leverage on the existing work under the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, where there is initiative on ASIS and ATR, which is ASEAN Trade Repository. So we will take information from there. So this particular initiative will only start after the completion of those ASIS as well as ATR. So the expected starting date will be later, sometime in 2018, rather than immediately now. But of course, some of the groundwork can be done at this particular juncture. So this is of particular importance, but it is challenging because if you are talking about technical regulations eventually. The fifth aspects, the fifth strategic area is people mobility. So there are 4 initiatives there. We know that intra-ASEAN travel is always around 45, 47, 48% of all total ASEAN travel. More than half are actually travelers from outside the region. So to enhance travel by making information easier, we are looking at how we can make the portal to have travel options, to have more information for travelers to utilize. So that basically we are not creating something new, but to leverage on the existing ASEAN tourism website that they have, and how we can enhance it further so that people can actually make reference to it and use the information there. The second aspects, the second initiative is linked to visa processes. Originally this has more than this, but subsequent discussion that we have narrowed down to just one particular initiative on visa, one particular key component of visa, which is to have an e-visa application process. So it means that anyone from outside the region who wants to come into the region can actually apply visa through an e-visa process. So you just need to go to a portal, and this is linked to the tourism portal, where you will be able to say, okay, I would like to apply visa for country A, B, C, D. among the 10 ASEAN member states. And then the visa application will be sent back to the respective country, and approval is done by the respective country. So then it will come back to the portal to tell you that you have received approval for the following countries. So that you don't have to go individually, one by one. But that will require each country having an e-visa process. So each country will need to look into this before you can do a regional. So the time frame is long. I think DGICM, which is handling visa and immigration issues, are meeting next week. So we'll see how that goes. The third aspect is, the third initiative is on vocational training programs. So in this context, there are some work already done in the ASEAN region. So I guess a lot of effort will be put into coming out with programs that can actually support vocational training that meets the industry requirements. So some of the ideas is also to link to having alumni networks, link to internship. I think in some country, for example, if you look at in Africa, like Renault has a plant, they have their own alumni process. And basically in those particular arrangements, they train the people to be able to supply to the industry. Not just to Renault, but to other industry. But of course, there will be some arrangement between the country. But this is going to be done at the ASEAN level. Of course, certain countries can basically take up that, and with the participation of the private sector industry. And the fourth aspect is on higher education exchange. This basically links to provision of, one of them is scholarships. The other one is to look at how we can encourage more mobility within ASEAN for students to go. I think this also linked to alumni, because most people in this region wants to go outside of ASEAN rather than within ASEAN. So we have to think about ways. So I guess that is a challenge that we need to think about, how we can encourage, unless you have a very strong alumni or you have a strong program. But for a university degree, that's going to be a challenge. But I guess we talk about this quite a bit. And there could be some ideas that can be actually put forward to do this. A good start could be a scholarship, exchange of scholarships between the university, right? So that is automatic in a sense. Once you get scholarship, you will automatically go. But the number won't be great. So how do you want to encourage people to eventually go? I think that would take much more effort than this. Okay, I've been told that I have a few more minutes, so let me now go to how do we ensure that we can implement these plan. So a lot of thought has been put into how we can implement the master plan and what are the things that we need to do. So there are 6 elements. First is strong focus and targets. Second is clear and aligned plans. Third is presence of core skills, incentives, and finance. Fourth is proactive stakeholder engagement. Fifth is robust performance management. And 6 is clear governance and ownership. So I'll go through one by one. When we talk about strong focus and targets, we don't really have targets in that sense. 5 strategic areas with 15 initiatives. So we will evaluate the master plan in terms of outcome, output, and input indicators. Input is the easiest, right? It's task-based, whether you have done this task, you have not done this task. The difficult one is the output and the outcome. Outcome is the most difficult, because whether whatever you do actually lead to that outcome is another question. So it will be evaluated in that 3 contexts. Impact assessment, I think that's a bit further down the road, so you won't get that at the initial stages. Clear governance and ownership. We have gone through the process to identify lead implementing body for each of the initiative. So there is a national focal point to be appointed at each of the initiative, so that we know who is in charge of what. right? So, but that is something that is missing in some of the other plans. Then there is also initiative level, national coordinator, because you have a focal point at the regional level, but you also need to have a focal point at national level, because implementation, a lot happens at the national level. So then you need to have a mechanism to coordinate. Some countries would need that, some countries may not really need that. So it depends on the setup of the particular country as well. Then the third aspect is clear and aligned plans. Basically, when we look at all these areas, we need to make sure that whatever we do is aligned with the sectoral plans, so that we're not doing something out of the blue, where and there was consultation process that has gone through. There were several rounds of consultation, but sometimes we always, in the ASEAN way, silence means consent, but silent doesn't necessarily always mean consent. But anyway, we will work through these different issues as we tackle implementation. The fourth aspect is presence of core skills. I think targeted capacity building activities, that's important. Sometimes we don't think a lot about what kind of capacity building activities required. So when someone I offer you capacity building on this, you accept. When I offer you that, you accept. But I think we need to think of it in a more strategic manner, in a sense that these are the capacity building needs that we need. So then we go to you and say that, okay, we need all this, right? Of course, some partners will fund certain capacity building activity because it's of interest to them. But so we had to find ways to match these different priorities of us and the partners themselves. Not easy, definitely. Going through this process a number of times, most of the time, people with the money usually have some bigger say than the rest. And then there's also need to have a strengthened secretariat. So in the context of implementation, secretariat will be one part, because we service all the different sectors, right? So the easiest way to get information flow is within the organization. That is what you think. Then the other aspect is maybe we have set up a committee of the permanent representative. So if there could be different ministry or agencies seconded to the committee of permanent representative, then I think communication can be also effective in that context. Then we have other mechanism, regional mechanism that has been put in place. You have mechanism like the AEC has their own consultative process, like COW, they call it Committee of the Whole. Then you have the social cultural, they have the SOCCOM, and then the political security has the ASCO and so on. So these are, but the problem is many of these forums are basically information sharing, right? So if you want to go from information sharing to something beyond information sharing, that will be something that we need to work on. But it's always good to have information sharing at the beginning, so that everybody knows that this is what each other people are actually doing. Then the fifth aspect is proactive stakeholder management. I guess we need to do more in terms of talking to the stakeholders, telling the stakeholders that this is what we are doing. And very often stakeholders will ask us one question that we sometimes struggle to answer: what is it in it for me? So how can I be part of this? So that is often the challenge, especially if you're from private sector, because a lot of these things may be at the policy level. So so that's something that we need to actually discuss, because a lot of engagement with the private sector are often in the policy level, right? So if you want to drill down to more nitty-gritty details, I guess that is something that we need to work on. And the last aspect is performance management system. We will have a semi-annual review mechanism where we will bring in the sectors involved in a particular initiative. So there will be 5 review meetings where we will have each of the sectors involved in the initiative under each of the strategic area to be part of that particular review meeting to discuss where we are, what are the challenges encountered, and what are the next steps that we need to take forward in order to move this issue. Then that is done at the regional level. Then of course it has to feed back to the national implementation. So with that, thank you very much. Look forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you.